All right, so today we're tackling one of the most fascinating and honestly misunderstood periods in all of history. I'm talking about these so-called 400 silent years that sit right between the Old and New Testaments. We're basically going to be detectives, piecing together a lost world from the clues it left behind. So let's jump right in. You've probably heard this idea before, right? That after the last prophet in the Old Testament, God just went quiet for 400 years. But is that really what happened? Were these centuries truly silent, or have we just not been listening in the right way?
Okay, so before we can even begin to answer that, we have to ask a more basic question. Where did this whole idea of the 400 silent years even come from? I mean, who started saying that? Figuring that out is really the key to unlocking this whole thing.
Well, it turns out the term itself is pretty specific. It comes from Protestant tradition. It's all based on this belief that after Malachi, the last prophet, prophecy just stopped. That direct line to God went dead. The prophet Amos even talked about a famine for hearing the words of Yahweh, and that's kind of the vibe they were going for, a spiritual radio silence. But hold on, because here's our first major plot twist. For millions and millions of people, we're talking Catholic and Orthodox Christians, this period was never silent, not even for a second. Why? Because their Bibles actually have books that were written during this time. We call them the Apocrypha. So right off the bat, we know this silence isn't some universal truth. Okay, so if it wasn't silent for everybody, what was actually going on? What can we prove? Let's start with the most solid evidence we've got, the stuff we can literally dig out of the dirt. Let's see what archaeology has to say about all this. And this brings us to a huge debate among scholars, and it's a fascinating one. What do you trust more, physical objects or written words? See, archaeology gives you the real, tangible stuff of daily life, pottery, foundations, weapons, but it's almost always broken and incomplete. On the other hand, texts give you names, dates, motivations, but they're always written by someone with an agenda. It's a real dilemma. And believe me, the challenges for archaeology are massive. For one, a lot of the most important sites, like Jerusalem, are still living cities. You can't just go dig them up. Plus, the evidence you do find is literally in fragments. It's like trying to build a 1,000-piece puzzle when you only have 50 pieces. And don't even get me started on dating this stuff. It's super controversial. So yeah, archaeology gives us a picture, but it's a really, really blurry one. But sometimes you find one tiny thing that just speaks volumes. Take this, for example. At the fortress of Masada, a place of a famous last stand, archaeologists found a small piece of a scroll. It had been buried on purpose, and on it was Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones coming back to life. I mean, think about that. It's this incredibly powerful clue about what these people were holding on to. A hope that even in the face of death, there could be a resurrection. Okay, so that's what the ground tells us. Now let's switch gears and look at the written accounts. And for this period, we have one main source, who also happens to be our most, let's just say, complicated witness. Let me introduce you to Flavius Josephus. Get this. He starts out as a Jewish general fighting against the Romans in the big revolt. But then he gets captured, and what does he do? He completely flips, switches sides, and becomes a historian writing for the Romans. Yeah, talk about a conflict of interest, right? And you can bet that shows up all over his work. Now, if you really want to get a sense of who we're dealing with here, you have to hear this one story from his life. It's wild. It happened at a place called Jotapah, and honestly, it tells you pretty much everything you need to know about Josephus's character. Okay, so picture this. Josephus and about 30 of his soldiers are cornered by the Romans, trapped in a cave. His men are adamant. They'd rather die than be taken prisoner. So they all agree to a suicide pact. But Josephus, who's always thinking, steps in. He says, whoa, guys, suicide is a sin. But then he suggests this pretty grim alternative. He says, let's draw lots and we'll just kill each other, one after another. And here's the kicker. They go through with it. One by one, they're killed. Until who's left? Josephus and one other guy. And wouldn't you know it, by what he claims is total luck, he's one of the last two standing. And at that exact moment, he has a total change of heart. He convinces the other guy, hey, let's just surrender. The Romans will probably be cool about it. And he walks out of that cave alive. I mean, the guy's a survivor. You have to give him that. But it also makes you question everything he writes, doesn't it? So what's the big takeaway here? It's that everything Josephus writes has this massive pro-Roman bias.
I mean, he blames the entire war on a few hotheads from the lower classes. He paints this ridiculously flattering picture of the Roman emperor. He even says the whole reason Jerusalem was destroyed was because God was punishing the Jews. You always have to remember who he's writing for, his new Roman bosses. But thankfully, Josephus isn't the only voice we have from this time. Putting our very biased historian to one side for a moment, what other writings are there? Well, this is where we get into some really interesting and controversial documents, books that give us a totally different window into what people believed.
And this brings us right back to the Apocrypha. Remember that collection of Jewish texts written right in the middle of our silent period? The name itself is kind of funny. It was coined by St. Jerome, a super famous Bible translator, who basically thought their origins were a little sketchy or obscure, so he separated them out. Protestants ended up following his lead and leaving them out of their Bibles, but Catholic and Orthodox churches, they kept them right in.
And this slide is a perfect example of just how much was going on back then. Check this out. You have two different books, both from the Apocrypha, talking about the exact same historical revolt, but listen to the difference. First Maccabees, it's all about honor, fighting for your nation here on earth, no mention of an afterlife. But then you read Second Maccabees, and it's completely focused on dying as a martyr and being resurrected to an eternal reward. So you have two Jewish groups looking at the same event with wildly different ideas about life and death. The idea that everyone believed the same thing is just wrong. And there's another whole category of books from this time that are just fascinating. They're called the pseudo-epigrapha, which is a fancy way of saying false writings. It was actually pretty common practice back then. You'd write a book with your new ideas, but you'd claim it was written by some ancient legendary figure, like Moses or Enoch. Why? Well, it gave your work instant credibility and authority. And you might think, okay, so what? But these books were hugely influential. I mean, get this. The Book of 1 Enoch, one of these pseudo-apocryphal works, is quoted directly in the New Testament, in the book of Jude. That just goes to show you that the writers of the New Testament were reading this stuff. These supposedly non-biblical ideas were absolutely part of the air they were breathing. All right, so let's take stock. We've got broken pieces of pottery, a historian we can't fully trust, and a bunch of books that people still argue about. It's a messy picture. But then, in the 20th century, something happened. A discovery so massive, it was like a bombshell that tied all these threads together and changed everything. 1947. I'm talking, of course, about the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're talking about a whole library, an entire library of ancient texts stashed away in caves for nearly 2,000 years. And inside, they found the oldest copies of biblical books we've ever seen, alongside the personal rules and writings of a very specific Jewish community living at the time. It was revolutionary. For the first time ever, we had a direct, uncensored, unfiltered peek into this world.
And that is how we do it. That's how we piece this lost world back together. You know, none of our evidence on its own is perfect. The archaeology is fragmented, our main historian switched sides, the books are controversial, but when you take all those flawed pieces and put them together, when you let them talk to each other, suddenly the silent years aren't silent at all. They start to speak, loud and clear. Because what we find is this incredibly vibrant, argumentative, and deeply spiritual time that literally set the stage for everything that came next, for both modern Judaism and Christianity. So that really leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? If this era wasn't silent, what was it trying to tell us?